The voice of sharing Durian ASEAN.
Hi, this is Arlene and you're listening to Durian ASEAN. Today we are going to have two guests in the studio, one guest in the studio, another one on the phone interview. The topic of today is regarding on GST, how GST will affect our society. So first of all, let me introduce, in the studio we have Anas Alam Faizli. He's the co-founder of Blindspot and he's also an oil and gas professional. Also on the line, we have Dr. Zainnal Ajamain. He's a Sabahan economist. First of all, welcome to the studio.
Hello.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So, first of all, I want to ask about what is GST after all? Who's going to start?
Well, GST is an acronym for Goods Services Tax. It's basically a regressive consumption-based tax where you will be taxed on consumption rather than it's like the income tax that you pay on a monthly basis from your yearly assessment. So it's a tax that is on the go. So the more you consume, the more taxation you will be taxed. But before this interview goes on further, I would just like to highlight that there are many discussions ongoing on GST or whether anti or pro GST. Always forget to look at a more holistic view of the GST itself. GST is just a form of taxation, just a form of or a way on how the government wanted to increase their income. And people like to compare GST like, I give you a simple example. It's like comparing a specification between purchasing a Porsche and a Toyota Corolla. They'll be comparing the specification rather than comparing whether the person wanting to buy the Porsche have money to buy the Porsche or not.
I see. And Dr. Zainnal, have you been working around the areas related to GST, and how much do you know about the GST in Malaysia work?
Well, the way I look at it, GST in Malaysia is quite similar to what they call the value-added tax, the VAT, which is basically consumption. Now, the problem here is this. Most of our people in Malaysia are wage earner. When I say wage earner, that means they have constant income a month. The problem here is this. They will spend 80% of their money that they earn every month for essential items, essential goods. That means consumption. Which means that today, when they are spending money today, I mean after the GST is implemented, that means they'll be paying for GST as well. Now, it's not a question of they're just buying one item, within a month. They will be buying several items. Now, some of these items, if you add them up, the GST will add up as well. That's number one issue. Number two issue, of course, there are essential goods which they say is non-taxable or exempted from this tax. Now the question here is this: did they study the value chain where they impose that percentage? Because what I'm saying here is this: okay, rice.
First of all, can you explain what is value chain?
Oh, value chain. Okay, let's put it this way: your rice doesn't come to your table by itself. It has to be sent from the fields to the warehouses. From the warehouses, it's sent to the stockyard, and then from the stockyard to the shop. From the shop, then probably you go and buy a kilo or 2 kilos or even 10 kilos. Then it goes to your house. Now, when we talk about all these chains that is happening, all these chains now are incurring also additional costs, which is the 6%.
I see. Another question I want to know is, how would the GST differ from our current tax on goods and services?
Well, okay, like our current goods and services, the minute what you buy, you just pay the tax. That's it. And as it is now, essential goods also is not taxable. I mean, it's not taxed, like rice and all that. So that is the price of the rice, basically from the field to your house. If you buy 10 kilo packet costing, say, 32 ringgit, okay, that is the price of the rice that is coming from the field to your house. That is today.
I see.
But once you put GST, you have to calculate the freight charges, the transport charges, the warehouse charges. All these will have to pay GST as well.
Mm-hmm. So it's a hidden tax, I guess, in a way.
It's not hidden tax. I believe they didn't study this thoroughly. They keep on saying that they have studied this thoroughly. I doubt that.
Mm-hmm. Anything you want to add on, Anas?
On top of what Dr. Zainnal has just mentioned on VAT and GST, I would like to just share the differences between VAT and GST. VAT practices a positive list, while GST apply a negative list. In VAT, only goods that are included in this positive list are taxable, while GST tax everything except items that is included in the negative list. So there is a significant difference. Yeah, there's a significant difference between VAT and GST, but both are consumption regressive taxation. And when I say it taxes everything, GST, I'm referring to every transactions made. Every transaction made is taxed through GST except for 4 items categorized into number 1, basic item, foods like sugar, salt, and even belacan, for your information.
Oh, we love belacan.
Yeah. And number 2, transportation. The tolls, highways, your buses ticket is not taxed. Also including anything with regards to education and health. And then water, electricity for the first 100 units, if I'm not mistaken. And finally, any transaction on housing, property, and selected financial services. So besides all these 4 categories, every transaction is taxed. Now, the take is why people saying that we are burdening the people on GST. Why people say that? Because every transaction is taxed, hereby creating credit GST and debit GST, because you are able to collect debit from the custom. Maybe Dr. Zainnal wants to continue on that.
Yeah, go ahead, Dr. Zainnal.
Well, let's put it this way, like the tariffs and all that. I think after 2015, we may not have that issue anymore, because after the full implementation of AFTA, our tariffs will be adjusted, especially when you say AFTA plus 3, meaning to say the ASEAN countries plus China plus Korea and Japan, I think. Yeah.
I see. Regarding on the list that you mentioned just now of things that will be taxable under the GST, where do you get the list? Is it open, transparent within the government?
It's a published list. I'm sure you can go to the government website. You can get the list. But basically, it's the 4 categories that I just mentioned. And when I say why the tax is burdened down to the people, is let me explain further. As an example, if when the factories purchase products, all transactions are taxed. So the items the factories purchase will be taxed 6%. But at the same time, the item that they use as cost, they can get debit GST, so they will be refunded. And this will go through down the supply chain, at the end of the day, consumers that will not be refunded. So they'll end up taking all the burden
Correct.
of all the 6% that goes through all transactions. That's the difference between biggest difference between GST and sales service tax just now. SST is at the end, you tax one time. Here we're
Right.
talking about every transaction from the factories to the distributor to the user to the consumer. Every transaction, as long as like in those days, right? We as Muslim have to say, saya beli saya jual, right? As
Correct.
long as there is saya beli saya jual, there is 6% GST,
Yes.
except for the 4 categories mentioned.
Yeah. Saya beli, saya jual is I buy and I sell.
Plus 6%
Plus,
GST.
you see, this is the thing that I was mentioning to you, that the input tax and output tax. Basically, what we are looking at, I mean, a lot of discussion is actually just restricted to output tax. The input tax, as what Anas has explained just now, never discussed.
I see. It was never mentioned in any of the explanation within the government bodies to the public, isn't it?
That is correct.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of this is not disclosed to the public.
I'm sure there are information and explanation with regards to the subject, but it's quite technical, Dr. Zainnal. I think it would be
That's
unfair.
right.
Yeah, it would be unfair to say that the government is not explaining on these issues, but they are trying to implement it. So I'm sure from the angle that they are taking, it will be beneficial to the government. Yeah.
Yeah,
You want to
that's right.
implement it. The information is there, but what kind of information is being highlighted? And it's very
I mean,
technical. So
Yeah, you watch the television, the advertisement. Most of the time, they are talking about the output tax.
Oh, you're referring to the propaganda, you mean? GST
Yeah,
propaganda.
exactly.
Yeah. So anyway, before we go too deep into GST, we still have to go back to my initial points that in implementing taxation, the government is a simple issue. The government want to increase their income through taxation. There are many various form of taxation. There's capital gain tax. There's RPGT. There's inheritance tax. There are the income tax
There's
that
so much.
everybody is. But question is implementing GST is not really about GST is good or bad. It's about is GST the best way to increase taxation in the Malaysian setup. I think that is the number one question.
But you know,
Correct.
do you know GST exists in many of the developed nations, and is
right.
considered as part of the consumer tax for the developed nation. And why it is? I mean, in this case, in Malaysia, I mean, we can give the excuse that we are still not yet a developed nation, but it's also, I mean, if you see another way, GST tax can reduce the consumption rate of consumers in that sense. Do you agree with that?
I
No,
can't
it
see
won't.
the relation between being a developed nation, a developing nation, or a non-developed or a developing nation at all with regards to a taxation system. I think that has to be boiled down to how you manage your income and where you want to spend the money. So, general public always worried or thinks that managing a budget of a nation is very difficult. Only expert can do that. Only economists like Dr. Zainnal can do that. But it's relatively just like managing your household income.
Correct.
It's just like managing your
Difficult.
household income. You want to
Right.
increase your revenue. Where do you increase it? So how are you managing
Do you
your
have to
OPEX,
take
your
up a
overhead?
second job or something like that?
Yeah,
exactly.
but I want to also ask a question. But why many developed nations see GST as the next step in terms of having in their country? So when it comes to a lot
That
of
goes back to the first initial point, the Malaysian setup. Even 500 nations, okay, there's only close to 200 nations in the world. Even 500 nations implement GST, so what? I mean, we should be looking at Malaysian context. We are a nation with, like Dr. Zainnal mentioned, which majority, 90% of us are wage earners. And in fact, we are low-income earners. Having said that,
Correct.
if you look at EPF database, 79% of our employees are earning below 3,000 ringgit. Even if we look at our income tax collection, out of 12 million employees, only 14% are eligible for tax, and this contribute 10% to government's income.
I want to ask Dr. Zainnal, why do you think other countries, what is the main purpose of other countries implementing GST, and why we should not follow them?
Look, let's take a look at things rationally. There is one thing to be in fashion, all right? There is another thing to really understand your own country and look at your own country on how it should be developed. Right from the beginning, when we formed Malaysia, all right, our emphasis was the wage earner. That was our emphasis, okay? There was migration from the rural to the urban areas. So we created jobs in the urban areas, all right? Now, even government is willing to do away with some of the taxes as long as we have jobs. So, as Anna says, we are wage-earning country. So, when you impose this, you impose GST, you are actually burdening the wage earner. And when you burden them, how are they going to be productive? That's another question.
Yeah, Dr. Zainnal, I think I can relate to Arlene's question. GST is efficient. Yeah, it provides the government a stable income, right? Let's say this year you implement GST and you are able to collect, say, 10 billion ringgit, and the income will be stable. The next year you will collect maybe 11 billion, and the following year 12. So it's an income, it's stable and it's efficient because you tax every transaction. So that's why a lot of nations are using it. But we have to go back to the Malaysian setup. Why we are not implementing capital gain tax? Because it's not a stable income, because it is based on capital gains occurring in the market in Malaysia. So and it's also not pro business. So are we implementing policies that are pro business or pro people? That is our biggest question. And if you take a look at our income, OPEX and CAPEX for the last 10 years, back in 2003, 2002, our income was around 70 billion ringgit only. Now we are close to 200 billion in a matter of 10 years. And the OPEX should be stagnant. I mean, increasing through by the way of inflation, but it's not. The OPEX is like climbing uphill as high as our income. Our income is surging upwards for the past 10 years, and our OPEX is following our income. So this really suits the pepatah. What's the pepatah, Dr. Zainnal? Lagi besar periuk, lagi besar kerak. That's exactly what the government is doing. You used to earn 70 billion back in 2002, 2003. Now you're earning close to 200 billion, and your OPEX is close to that number.
First of all, what is OPEX?
OPEX is operating expenditure, maintenance, emolument, salary, the cost of paying electricity, water. That's why they're closing the lights on the street after 10 because of to save OPEX. That's why Prime Minister Abdullah Badawi last time said we have to save budget, so to reduce OPEX.
But you see, that's the thing. The OPEX now, our Malaysian OPEX now, has to reach about 80% of our expenses. The 200 billion, 80% of that. So what is left? Basically, the one that is left, this is what we started to call development expenses or CAPEX. Now, you spend 20%, you spend 80% to do 20% job. That's not good business.
I see.
You should reduce that. This is the thing. We have been talking about privatization and all that. That means we are shifting the expenses from public sector to the private sector. And yet, our OPEX is getting bigger and bigger instead of shrinking. There's something wrong here.
I have another question. There are some think tanks and organizations that say, Malaysia is not ready. You know, we are not a developed nation. Malaysians are wage earner, and a lot of us are living in in a quite tight socio-economic conditions. But they also say that, you know, give it a time. It is still something that the government should still look forward in terms of implementing it. Do you share the same sentiment with some of these think tanks and
I
organizations?
think you should divorce the statement being a developed nation and GST. There is no correlation between being
No
a developed
correlation.
nation or implementing GST. Either you are a developed nation or a developing nation or whatever nation you want to call yourself. Whatever policies you want to implement, taxation or policy, it has to be considering basic fact sheets and setup and context of the nation that we are talking about. And here we are talking about Malaysia. We have to understand our population. We have to understand the income that our population is generating. And we have to understand how any taxation will cause effect to the people. I give you a simple example. Like in America, there are times when income tax was as high as 70%, and then came in a new administration. They slashed the tax all the way down to 40%, even as low as 20%. So why? It doesn't matter if you're a developed nation or not a developed nation. It has to go back to the setup, to the Malaysian context.
Mm-hmm. Anything you want to add on, Doctor?
Well, that I mean, throughout the years, we have been, slashing even our own taxation
by 1% every year.
I think some tax is more than that. So as it goes down and down, you have to look for alternative means of income.
Mm-hmm.
But whatever we have as it is now is not sufficient to, I would say, we need about 200 billion a year.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to have that type of income.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the GST to me is a very convenient way of doing it. That means we don't need to think, we don't need to do work. We just impose on it. There are other things that we can do to actually get that amount that we need. I think the last interview we were talking about Bimiaga, for example.
Oh yeah, that economic region in the area of Borneo there, Bimiaga.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So Bimiaga have got 400 billion market. All right. If we just capture 50%, that gives us 200 billion. Government tax 10%, that's 20 billion. That's as big as what the GST is supposed to produce.
Mm-hmm. I see.
I don't think they are going in that direction.
Mm-hmm. Why do you think the government is so insisting on implementing GST? I mean, what is the main reason? Is there any?
They want more money.
But if in other words, you say that there are other ways of getting money through taxation, and there are other different kinds of taxation. Why they are not utilizing that? And another of your statement about some of the economic growth region that the government can utilize or tap into. Why they are not thinking outside the box and go into all these different alternatives and instead still insisting on GST?
Okay, I'll answer that.
Mm-hmm.
You see, the problem with our country right now is that we are going corporate. We are looking at corporation. We are not looking at people at all.
Exactly.
The
Business
60s,
versus
70s, we are looking at people. But now we are looking at corporate. And I can bet you, if we have another 1997 crisis, the government will be bailing out corporation instead of all those pitiful bankruptcies, bankrupt people. You see, this is the problem when you start shifting into corporate.
Mm-hmm.
We cannot go that direction. That's not us.
when you say the government is going into corporate, is there a certain fundamental ideology that the government is subscribing, or is it something that is because as a reaction towards the global capitalist economy?
Well, look, even if it's a reaction, I mean, look, you have your own sense. These are your people. The big corporation is nothing to you. When you go back every 5 years, you go back to the people, not to the corporations. So let's focus here. That means you look after your people is good, the corporations will come.
I see. Is there in any case that the government is pushing on GST, as you say, is a stable income source for the government, and the government is in high debt, as we may know. So is it a reason, probably an ad hoc reason, that the government wants to reduce its debt burden? What do you think?
That means they are looking at convenience. They are not looking at really working it out. Okay, you are in debt, all right? But it doesn't mean that you want to find the easy way to actually just plug a hole in your debt, because GST is not going to plug the whole debt. It's going to be small. It's not going to be big. But the impact on the people is going to be big.
I see. And Alam, Anas, do you want to add on anything on this?
Recently, we have been talking about inequality, and Malaysia by far is among the highest nation in ASEAN with the largest disparity between rich and poor, and imposing GST will continue to add this widening gap of income between the rich and poor. Is not going to help. And I think why many people are against GST is because they feel that the income generated by the government is high, but the leakages and the wastages is also high. So when you cannot manage this properly, why are you shifting the burden to the people? Why are you shifting?
It's not going to solve.
Yeah, why are you targeting the people to pay for whatever incompetence that is happening? So I think that is why many people are unhappy and dissatisfied with the proposed implementation of GST, because it's straightforward. We are going to tax people. Of course, you say it will reduce people's consumption, but that we are talking about the rich people. I mean, the average people don't consume that much, but they end up paying a larger portion of their income compared to the richer people, where those that you are going to tackle supposedly by making them more efficient in consumption will be the rich people. But we are not looking at a nation composed with many rich people. Majority of the people are relatively poor.
But there are subsidies on certain goods and services, isn't it? So how would GST truly affect the Malaysian society in that way?
Even the subsidies is questionable. I mean, as it is now. I mean, look, sugar has no subsidy anymore, correct? But the monopoly on the importation and distribution of sugar is still in place. So that monopoly actually determines the price. It's not the market.
I see.
If you want to buy sugar in the world market, it's cheaper. If you calculate it, in the world market, the price of sugar is only about our ringgit, $1, about $1.80. But why is it when it reaches the shelves in the shops, it goes to $2 something? There's something wrong somewhere. And we have already abolished sugar subsidy.
I see.
Now, the same thing with rice.
Yeah, the sugar subsidy that cost 240 million ringgit per annum compared to the billion spent on IPPs.
Exactly. And then similarly with rice.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you can take a look at the world price of rice. It's not that expensive.
Mm-hmm.
But when you go to the supermarket is expensive. It's like $3.20 a kilo.
I see. In the long run, how would GST really affect the socio-economic of Malaysian people? Let's say they implement GST for the next 10 years. How would the people suffer, or maybe they don't have any problem with it? I mean, what do you see in this case? What would hit the most?
Oh, as I have mentioned just now, most of us are wage earners. And we spend 80% of our wage actually for our consumption.
90% of us are wage earners.
Exactly. I mean, 90% are wage earner, but we use 80% of our wage for consumption. Food, food, clothes, children. That's how much we spend.
So you'll be expecting more BRIM or any those kind of welfare handouts?
No, BRIM is a useless thing. You don't do that. I mean, look at South America. Don't we learn anything from there?
Share me more about the case study of South America.
I mean, look, okay, a very good example. Have you ever heard of Evita Peron?
The singer.
No, the wife of Peron, the president of Argentina.
Of course. Everybody remembers that beautiful song.
Exactly. Now, remember, she used to distribute money in the streets to the poor. But the more she distributes, the more expensive things become. So where does it end? I look at BRIM. BRIM doesn't even cover 90% of the population. It covers probably less than 1%.
What do you mean when you say covers less than 1%, Dr. Zainnal?
I mean, they distribute it out.
You mean the number of recipients?
Yes.
Oh, I beg to differ. BRIM is distributed to more than half of Malaysians.
Well, not
number of households, I mean.
Not in my part of the world. and in some places, they even slash it into half.
I see. Well, there's another way to look at it, Dr. Zainnal. When BRIM is distributed to more than half of the population, so we can safely say more than half of the population is relatively poor, in need of BRIM help, in need of government's assistance. Cash handout is also practiced in some other countries, but not as much. But it's meant to reduce the gap of inequality between the rich and poor. But it's normally used as a temporary measure, and it has been proven not to be a long-term solution if we are talking about BRIM, because we are not addressing the fundamental issues solution. This is like the pepatah. Teach a man to fish and fish, etc.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Do you think GST will hit the most towards the middle class and the working class? I mean, with the working class, they would probably receive certain handouts, and maybe their lifestyle would not truly be affected by GST. But what about the middle class? They have a certain standard of living, and with the GST, it would probably hit them harder than other social class. Do you agree with that?
That is very obvious.
Mm-hmm. But why aren't the middle class people voicing out on this? In fact, a lot of the GST supporters are people who are from the middle class strata.
It haven't hit them yet.
Mm-hmm.
They have to be. I mean, they have to feel it. Then they will start coming out and talking about it. Because look, you're spending. Food is one thing. Your children going to school. Do you think it's going to be cheaper now? The buses. It's not going to be any cheaper. the tuition is not going to be any cheaper.
Mm-hmm.
And in the middle class, these are the activities of the family.
Mm-hmm.
All of this will be affected.
Mm-hmm. Anas, most of the goods and services that will be taxed under the GST are goods and services that will be used mostly by the middle class, isn't it?
Basically, it's used by everybody. Let me start this again. Every goods will be taxed except for the 4 categories. Even the pen that I'm holding now will be taxed. The phone that I'm holding now will be taxed. In fact, if you going to extend this office, if you want to extend this office of yours, it will be GST taxable. Every transaction, as long as there's transaction, it will be taxed, except for the 4 categories. So
even every time you speak over the phone.
yeah.
Oh, okay.
So it will inevitably incur inflation. The price of goods items will increase, goods and services, and everything will be impacted by GST.
Mm-hmm. Can you give example of a good that will be taxed by GST and what kind of price it will end up being? Although you said it's a 6% of tax, but when you say it's a chain of tax from the input to the output, so in actuality, what is the real percentage or the real price that a good will be priced at? I mean, I give example for, let's say, a 1 ringgit pencil or a 1 ringgit pen. How much the end price would be with the goods and tax services being implemented on?
You have to break down the components that is involved
Correct.
in the makeup of that one
Pencil.
final goods. Like for pencil, we're referring to the lead and the wood and the paint to coat it and the ink to print the label. So all you have to go and walk through the components.
Correct.
So there'll be tons of transaction just to make a pencil, right? First you have to purchase, I don't know, I'm not that expert in the making of a pencil.
Yeah, I mean, in actuality, how many folds would it be increased in terms of the price? Would it be like maybe twice as much expensive or 3 times?
You cannot simply do a direct calculation or a simplistic calculation like that. Yeah, you have to simulate the calculation. You have to break down all the components and everything that is involved, and there will be you have to calculate the debit and credit GST also. So I can't give an offhand answer at the moment. Maybe Dr. Zainnal can give an answer.
It's not that simple. That's the reason when the government in the Dewan Rakyat was saying that we have studied the method thoroughly, it really worries me.
Mm-hmm.
Because did they really study the method thoroughly?
Mm-hmm.
I doubt very much. All this value chain or supply chain or whatever you call them, have to be calculated from the beginning to the consumption.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not just one item. It's so many items. So I don't think they did a thorough study on that one.
I see. What about in other countries? I mean, it seems like in other countries where they are poor, I mean, there are a huge number of working class people, they also have to pay their share of goods and tax services, even though it is a developed country. So how does the government of other countries deal with this kind of situation?
Well, you have to take a look at their income stream. There are so many other income streams that they have apart from this. Because as I said, the GST probably would generate about, say, 23, 27 billion a year compared to our spending requirement of about 200 billion a year. So there are so many other ways of trying to generate that amount of money. it doesn't necessarily mean you have to tax the people in this way. Because you have to bear in mind, as Anas repeatedly said, Malaysia is a working class.
I did say that.
Well, most of us are working class, 90%.
I said
Wage
majority of us, 90% are wage earners, and the majority of the population.
So how do you define wage earner?
Low income earners and relatively poor.
I want to ask regarding on how it would affect Malaysian society in between the rural areas and the urban areas. How would it affect both of these different strata of society?
Before we go to that question, maybe I wanted to add, just now you mentioned about the taxation and other nations, etc.
For their working class.
Yes.
Yeah.
Again, we have to look at this holistically. Different nations have a different understanding of how big or how small their government is. Some nations have bigger governments. Their governments are involved in supplying more to the people, and some have smaller governments. Or part of it is privatized, etc., etc. There are nations that have higher taxation compared to other nations that have lower taxation. At the same time, there are nations that spend a lot on their social transfers, cash transfers, and have higher level of welfare compared to other nations. Again, this have to be looked from a more holistic view. You cannot have a piecemeal discussion focusing like just on GST, trying to implement whether we go or not. You have to look at a bigger spectrum, understanding our, like I said before, our income, our OPEX, our CAPEX, our welfare plan, our education system, our assistance for health, our police, our military. There's so many things that have to be taken into account before deciding. But the biggest problem that is happening at the moment, I think, is people keep arguing whether GST is a good taxation system or not. Arguably, it's a good taxation system, it's efficient, it provides a steady income stream to the government. But is it the best solution for Malaysia? We have to take a look in Malaysian context. You have to look how the income is earned, how it will affect the people, how it will affect the price of goods, how it will affect the people, the working class, because it will affect them severely, because they are already facing increasing cost of living compared to the cost of living back in the 70s. Our cost of living now today is higher, and for the past 15 years our salary has not been surpassing the real wages has not been surpassing inflation.
So there are other major issues related to socio-economy that the government should look further rather than trying to impose GST straight away, isn't it?
I'm sure they have taken a look at that. What I'm trying to say is the discussion should be divorced from the discussion of anti-GST, pro-GST, what is the pro of GST, cons of GST, looking at it as a single discussion. It has to take into account the condition of the people, the context of Malaysia, how much money we are earning, how much money we are spending, and to have a holistic understanding of the whole concept and how the government, the size of our government, and what is the government's responsibility, what have been privatized, and having understand everything, then only a real discussion on GST can take place for the policymakers to make a decision.
Very interesting. So in the meantime, right, if the government is truly interested to get more revenue to its pocket, what is the best way? Like you suggested a few number of taxation, but if you are talking about in a holistic manner, besides taxation, are there any other ways
it has
that
to go two ways. One is increase revenue. It doesn't have to be through taxation. There are other ways to do it. You can increase, you can increase trade, you can increase so many things, or you can reduce subsidy, or you can reduce spending. And importantly, you have to reduce leakages, you have to reduce wastages, you have to reduce the high number of OPEX. That is just crazy. You look at the graph from 2000 to current. I still cannot comprehend why our OPEX skyrocket just like that, following our income. It really like lagi besar periuk, lagi besar kerak or something. I still cannot
Is there
comprehend
an English equivalent for that?
I don't know. Maybe Dr. Zainnal know. I'm not so sure.
Yeah, Dr. Zainnal, add more your comment on this.
Well, of course, we have been increasing, especially on our OPEX, especially if you take a look at it, especially during the 90s. I mean, it's just ballooning. I don't think it's at the national level only. Even at the state level, it is also ballooning. If you see the trend, it's quite similar. About 80% of the income, the state income, is also spent on OPEX. Similarly, at the national level, where 80% of the income actually of the income is actually spent on OPEX. So, in the 90s, when we started to talk about privatization and all that, basically we are supposed to reduce the public sector. But instead of reducing it, we are actually expanding on it.
Mm-hmm.
So this is where I think there is a problem in the implementation. Of course, when people talk about leakages, they are quite sensitive to it. On one side, prices of goods are increasing worldwide, okay? But at the same time, you also started on, especially on physical projects. This is the way I look at it, where Malaysia is going since the 90s. We have been building infrastructures. We have been building bridges. We have been building, big, I would say, buildings.
Mm-hmm. Mega projects. Yes, you're talking about.
It's physical.
Mm-hmm.
It's not building the people itself.
Mm-hmm.
That one have been sidelined since the 90s.
Why is it being sidelined? I mean, what is the case? What has been done since the 90s until now that our country has fallen apart in terms of certain areas of improvisation?
I think since the 90s, we have been slowly moving into being a corporate country instead of being a country.
Mm-hmm.
That's the whole problem.
Are you going to talk about TPPA now?
That's even worse.
When you say our nation is moving towards a more corporate country, what are the key criteria of a state corporate nation would be like? I mean, I know you would probably cite Singapore as one of the best example in Southeast Asia, but what are the key criteria that you see Malaysia is moving towards that direction?
I mean, we have been giving emphasis on big corporations.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if that's the direction you're going, then I would quote the United States, because the United States have been going that direction. And when the economy is, I would say, in trouble, what they have done is actually to pump more money into the capital market through their quantitative easing, by printing more money and pumping it to the capital market instead of really looking at the people per se. Now, the corporation, in order to get more margin, they will have to put the more of the operation offshore. So most of them do their operation, their fabrications and all that in China. And only the completed goods goes to the United States. But the problem is consumption is dwindling because most of the people that work in most of the factories in the United States now don't have jobs. And they don't have money to buy these goods. So it's a vicious circle. Now, if we are looking at that as an example, and we look at Malaysia, if we are emphasizing on the corporate instead of, I would say, like right now, we should be concentrating on the SMEs, where it employs a lot of people.
Additional taxation that I think that can be introduced just to if they want to increase revenue can be, for an example, would be the capital gain tax, but it's not really pro-business, so I don't know. And then we have the inheritance tax, where you can tax those who have 40 billion ringgit in their account. When they pass away, we can take some of their money, but that will be touching some very powerful and influential people. That's not pro-rakyat.
But what is the defense of the economists, the pro-establishment economists
not
on
implementing capital gain tax?
No, in terms of
Inheritance tax.
having GST as the way forward. What is the main argument? Their main
Oh,
argument?
they just want to increase. Like I said before, they want to increase revenue. It's efficient. You tax every transaction, and it's a consistent stream of income.
But why they don't see other forms of taxation as the way forward? Why must it be GST? What is their reason on that?
That is difficult for me because if we are in their position, we will not be implementing GST. You're asking me a very tough question. But like I said, they should be looking at other form of taxation that I've just mentioned, and they can increase levy for foreign workers, example. So we can have our local workers flooding the construction industry, the services industry, and also at the factories. You can increase the levy for foreign workers. We can increase the salary of our people. You have to increase the income of the people in order to introduce a consumption-based tax. If you don't do that, it's purely hypocrisy.
So
at one point, you want to increase taxation through consumption, but you're not doing anything to increase the income of the people you mean to tax.
So you are not against the idea of a consumption tax. It's just the manner of it being implemented.
No, I'm against consumption tax being implemented in Malaysia. That will be the answer. You can also reduce tax incentive for the big corporation. They are having tax exemption for many things, and they can pay less tax than small fish like us, small fishes like professionals. You see, if you have ever had a chance to see their tax exemption, you see how all these corporations are paying less tax than small fishes like us. And that is something that they should take a look. But the problem is, when you implement capital gain tax, you are touching the businessman. When you implement inheritance tax, you are touching powerful people. Don't do that. Let's touch our people. Let's tax them. They can't do anything about it. And it will increase our revenue.
So are you saying that the government now is being controlled, or at least is being influenced hugely by the business
No, I didn't
community?
say that. You said that. I'm just saying these taxes, capital gain tax will affect businessmen. Inheritance tax will affect influential people. That's all.
There are so many ways of doing this. I mean, look, I talk about Pimniaga. That's one other way of doing it. You know, even if you don't want to touch on income tax, you don't want to touch on inheritance tax, then you look at new market and open that market. Then we can sell more goods. But these are not being looked at. I don't understand.
We also don't understand. But just to wrap things up, why do you think, I mean, if there's a way for the government to listen to the people, why do you think, what is the main reason that the government should not impose GST on Malaysian, not now and not later?
I think that now or later is really not what to say. It's not a real issue here. There are so many ways to increase revenue. We shouldn't be saying that don't do this now, do it later. But I'm just saying the context in Malaysia, it will burden the people because the composition are comprised of low income earners. And it doesn't matter if it's 10 years from now or 20 years from now. We will have to take a look 10 years from now, We have to take a step back and study what is happening 10 years from now. And hopefully, by that, we are already having many income generation sources rather than GST. And at that time, our people salary is no longer 23% of GDP as it is of now. It will be 50% of GDP.
Should be increased in tandem.
Yes.
But what I'm saying here is we have a lot of creative people in Malaysia. Okay, tap them and get them to think about other sources of revenue and its implication. I mean, it's available. We have so many universities, for example. Why don't we make use of these people? They have ideas.
So, thank you, Anas, and also thank you, Dr. Zainnal. It has been a pleasure speaking to both of you regarding on the GST.
Yes, thank you very much.